China's Human Rights Institute issues a report hitting back at allegations made by Western think tanks on the treatment of Xinjiang ethnic minority workers. Can this report set the record straight? What is the true picture of Xinjiang's employment and labor rights situation? Welcome to The Point, coming to you from Beijing. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. On Monday, China's Human Rights Institute at the Southwest University of Political Science and Law released an investigation report on the employment situation of Xinjiang migrant workers. The report refutes allegations made by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's report and the U.S. congressional bills, such as Uygur Forced Labor Prevention Act. These reports had accused China of forcing ethnic minorities in Xinjiang to work under the guise of poverty alleviation programs. Are these arguments warranted? Do we have the facts that can speak for themselves? We are joined now in Beijing by Dr. Wang Jiang, researcher from Institute of Law at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and in Dongshan we have Jerry Gray, a British-Australian who lives in China and traveled across Xinjiang on a bike. Welcome, gentlemen. Jerry, let me go to you first. The report, which is entitled Investigation Report on the Situation of Xinjiang Outbound Young Migrant Workers of All Ethnic Groups, that is its official name. It is released after multiple allegations made against Xinjiang and its labor programs. So, Jerry, what do you make of course, first of all, the Australian think tank's accusations and now China's counter-argument?
Well, I haven't seen the Chinese counter-argument as yet, just heard about it today. Of course, it's just been released. But the information that's coming out of ASPI seems very, very questionable at best. What we're seeing there, most of the information seems to be coming from either interviews with dissidents, interviews with criminals who've left the area. There doesn't seem to be anybody involved in that report that they've produced who's actually even been to Xinjiang. They do view Xinjiang from satellite imagery, and they draw conclusions based on linking with Adrian Zen's report, which talks about how much barbed wire, how many fences and beds, and how much concrete has been moved into the region, and contracts for building schools, building factories. So yeah, I can see why they can draw some conclusions, but the conclusions really need to be questioned on the ground rather than by an analyst who I believe is only 23, 24 years old, working straight out of university in a think tank in Canberra looking at satellite pictures. So I would say very questionable information coming out of Australia. And once I've seen information from China, then I'd probably have more to say about that.
So, Dr. Wang, you studied the issue extensively. What is Xinjiang's labor and employment program all about?
Well, the whole point is about the helps the people getting out of the poverty issue and helps them to get a better life. In fact, that's what it does in the past few years, and it do a successful job. And so we can say the research point from the Chinese side, it is increasing the income per person, sometimes both, and sometimes even triple, even more. And I think this whole program is doing a pretty good job of helping Xinjiang people. I mean, for the contemporary China, there is a very obvious situation or problem here, is that we develop quite like imbalanced. For sure, we have like a city like Beijing and Shanghai is quite developed, but we also have area like Xinjiang, and some people still struggling with the poverty issue, and they are vulnerable when they're facing the counterterrorism issue and also the counter-extremism issue. So I think the whole project here is just to help the people get a job, get a better life.
Well, Jerry, a Canberra-based think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, has painted a rather dark picture, saying in one report that they have identified 27 factories in 9 Chinese provinces that are using Uyghur Xinjiang labor transferred from Xinjiang since 2017. Actually, between 2017 and 2019, they estimate that at least 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of Xinjiang and assigned to factories through labor transfer programs under a central government policy known as Xinjiang Aid. How credible is this ASPI report, in your opinion?
I would say the statistics are probably quite realistic, and I would say it is quite possible that a lot of people have left Xinjiang to go and work in factories in the same way that a lot of people have left Hunan or Sichuan or Yunnan or Guangxi provinces to come and work in the area where I live, in the southeast of China. This is a policy that has been in place in China since your reform and opening in 1978-79. Once that started, factories opened in areas that were more accessible to the Western world, where the customers, where the market was. So the factories opened on the East Coast, of course, so the East Coast developed. And I would suggest that Xinjiang got left behind, as did Gansu, Ningxia, places like this, which are quite a long way from any coastal port. Now, if those people want to get jobs, then they need to travel. Now, forcing them to travel, probably unlikely. Asking them if they want to, I think that would probably be very likely. So I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers are somewhere near accurate, but the reasoning behind people traveling, it's extremely common. I literally know hundreds of Chinese people who do not come from the city where I live. They've come here as migrant workers. They often come here living and working in dormitories, and they spend 1, 2, 3, even 5 years here. Sometimes they settle here, but they eventually, many of them, go home with a lot more money than they left. They're sending money back, and it is a poverty alleviation, but it's also a wealth distribution system, and it works very, very well inside of China. And I think it's a cultural issue that Westerners, including myself when I first came here, we really don't understand that Chinese people do this quite normally and quite acceptable.
Yeah. Dr. Wang, I mean, I want to pick up on what Jerry just said. Actually, a report from Xinjiang Development Research Center also showed that the minority groups actually have a strong desire to go out of the inland cities to the coastal areas for employment. For instance, in 4 prefectures in southern Xinjiang, 86.5% of the labor force in the villages there are willing to work outside their hometown. How do you see the role of the Chinese government's program here?
Well, I mean, that's a very difference here between the Chinese report and also the Australian reports, research reports here. And you can say the Chinese reports, they actually do the questionnaire and do the inquiry to count how many people are actually willing to do that. And we see a very high percentage is that Uyghur people or any of the ethnic people, I mean, willing to live in Xinjiang and go to see the world and to see the whole China, to embrace opportunities here. And but for another hand, if we look at the Australian research reports, and there is nothing. They do a very little job to actually to touch the first-hand material, basically no first-hand material. And the whole research is based on the well, mislead information, unconfirmed reports, and sometimes even the fake news. So just as the Chinese reports showing that, we do a very successful programs here.
Right. Beijing's official report also said that from 1978 to 2019, the per capita GDP of Xinjiang has increased 172-fold. In 2019 alone, 480,000 new urban jobs were created, and nearly 3 million rural surplus workers, labor, were transferred for employment. What does employment mean for the economy, especially for places like Xinjiang? Dr. Wang.
Oh, yeah, sorry. And I mean, if you look back to the history, that Xinjiang suffered from the terrorism for decades. And right now, of course, the whole world suffered from the pandemic, and Xinjiang itself, if you follow the news, and they've suffered from another wave of the pandemic. So it is extremely important to help this vulnerable area, and also the vulnerable people here. And I think the Chinese program on the job programs here is, and it is not only about the job itself, it's about developing the whole situation in this area. and to improve not only the income by the person and also the family, but also improve the human rights situation in general in this area.
Right. I want to show you this. Let's take a look at the Xinjiang's GDP composition, its GDP structure in 2014 and 2018. In that graphic over there, you can see clearly that although the proportion of industrial structure has been slightly adjusted, the proportion of primary industry is still high. That means people still, a lot of them still work in the agriculture, and they want to move up the industrial ladder and find jobs in the services sectors that can get them more pay and bonus. The imbalance of industrial internal structure would make it difficult to meet the demand of surplus labor employment, which is essential, as some would argue, for regional development. Jerry, we understand that we have you back with us. How do you look at the importance of employment for the tens of millions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for the development and the economy of the region?
It's a really good question. We, as you know, as you mentioned, we cycled across Xinjiang, and the distances are vast. We left Urumqi, and it's a 3-day journey to the next city on a bicycle. It's a long drive. Anybody who wants to take on the challenge of helping this region has to take that into consideration. It's a very, very difficult region to get people out off the farms and into factories because of the distances involved. And that's probably, in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges that Xinjiang and China faces. So much distance between the places where the people are and the places where the work is.
Right. Jared, did you finish, or we lost you again?
Yeah, no, I just think that the biggest challenge is the distance. Yeah.
Right, and also I want to, based on what you said, actually there are 70% of people in Xinjiang, those migrant workers seeking jobs in the coastal inland cities, 70% of them previously worked in agriculture, and most of them had a monthly income of no more than 1,500 kwai, the Chinese RMB, some even less than 500 yuan. But after going out to work, 84% of Xinjiang outbound migrant workers' monthly income has reached between 3,500 to 5,000 yuan. But we often do not see this in the Western report. Why do you think that's the case?
I think because they just don't know. They haven't been there. I traveled through in 2014, which was before the most recent trip. That was the last time I was there. Traveled through again in 2019, just 13 months ago, just over 1 year. And the differences were stark. The differences were amazing. There are more cars, there are more motorcycles, there is more transportation. There are better facilities in some of the towns. There are definitely better hotels. We were able to stay in some high-quality hotels, and we didn't have that in 2014 when we traveled through. The distances are a problem, but the townships and the cities are definitely improving, and you can see that quite clearly. You don't see so much of an improvement in the rural areas just yet, but that takes its time. I guess if I go back in another 5 to 6 years, we'll start to see that as the people who are currently leaving those farms are sending money home to their families in order to develop the relationships with the land and the relationships with the city. They will improve. It does happen here a lot. I've seen it in a lot of different places over the years that I've been in China.
Dr. Wang, you have been studying Xinjiang for quite a while. Talk to our viewers about the changes taking place there, especially in relations to employment and jobs and growth.
I mean, since you guys just talk about the agriculture, I mean, if anyone been to Xinjiang, been to south end of Xinjiang, you can say the natural environment over there is not that good. And also there is, for some area, it's just simply overpopulated. It's not enough land and water resource for just farming. So if you really need to get off the poverty, looking for a better development by yourself, and certainly you need looking somewhere else. So I think that is why so many people just choose to live in Xinjiang and get a job in the other part of the China. And also, as a Chinese citizen, as a taxpayer, and they have the very rights to do that. So about the generally economic in Xinjiang, I think it's getting better right now. From last October national holidays, and so many people travel in Xinjiang, which is quite good business for like a travel and other things.
Right, gentlemen, stay where you are. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion on the livelihood of Xinjiang's ethnic minority workers, where we focus on the agenda behind the think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Welcome back. Our guests are Dr. Wang Jiang and Jerry Gray, and also we have with us at this hour, Darwin in Darwin, Australia, actually, DARYL GUPPY. Sorry about that, CEO of GUPPYtraders.com. Darryl, let me go to you first. Over the past years, the opinions coming from Australian Strategic Policy Institute has been shaping and informing Australian public's understanding of China. On its website, the think tank describes itself in bold as an independent, non-partisan think tank that produces expert and timely advice for Australia's strategic and defense leaders. Is that the case?
No, it's not really the case. The evidence shows that it's not independent. It can be more accurately described as an agency of foreign influence, and it is registered on the Register of Foreign Influence that's maintained by the Australian government. The Australian news media does not identify ASPI reports as coming from a foreign government-backed research group. Of course, if a report is published by a Beijing think tank, then the media is always quick to note that the report is from a Chinese government-backed research group. The media should be more honest and balanced when it uses this material. And we're talking about Xinjiang, and what Jerry is saying and what Mr. Wang is saying concurs with the experiences that I've had when I've been travelling in Xinjiang, in Dunhuang and elsewhere in those regions.
So, by the way, what do you make of ASPS accusations about the labor and employment programs in Xinjiang?
It's a little bit hypocritical in many senses, because ASPI sponsors include US defence companies that use state-sponsored prison labour factories to produce military components like the wiring harnesses for the Bradley armoured vehicles. Now, many of those prisoners are paid 27 cents an hour, and yet you will find no ASPI human rights research reports into this US state-sponsored prison labour industry. These are the types of the military-industrial complex-backed research groups that delivered the weapons of mass deception, the very lies that convinced Western governments, including Australia, to get involved in the Gulf Wars.
Weapons of mass deception. A very interesting way to put it, Darryl. Jerry, let me go to you. A major part of its financial resources of ASPI come from the Australian Department of Defence. But in the most recent financial year, it accounted for a record low 43% of ASPI's 9 million total budget. ASPI's alternative sources of funding have grown even faster, which include defense contractors, technology companies, and contributions from foreign governments, many being strategic competitors to China. The Australian Senator Kim Carroll has said ASPI was taking nearly $450,000 from the U.S. State Department to track Chinese research collaborations with Australian universities. So, Jerry, I mean, of course, the SPI claims that itself is an independent think tank. What's your understanding of that?
Yeah, what Senator Carr raised was a very large amount, which the ASPI then denied and said it was half that amount. They, in fact, received only $250,000, which was not half, but more than half. But the senator was talking Australian dollars, and ASPI were talking US dollars. So the number was somewhere in the middle. So there's a little bit of deception, as Darryl mentions there. And this is something that ASPI are extremely good at. They take one fact and they present it as a totally different set of facts or set of information. And they're very, very good at it. I've seen this. I've had conversations with people in ASPI. In fact, Nathan Russo and I had quite a strong dialogue going on for quite some time. This is the guy who analyzes the satellite imagery, and he swears blind that I rode past concentration camps and I swear blind that I didn't. I'm not suggesting I didn't ride past compounds and places. I did, but I know what a prison looks like. I know what a concentration camp should look like. I've been a police officer. I've been involved in the security industry in prisons inside of Australia for many, many years. I've actually designed security systems for prisons. So I do know what I'm talking about when I say I didn't see a prison. So one set of facts and one set of opinions which are being presented as facts seem to be the way that ASPI manages its business. It's a very, very complex matter, and really what a former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, has just recently done is asked for a royal commission. He's asked for signatories to a petition to do this, and the last I saw it had nearly 400,000 signatories. Maybe it's more, it's a few days ago. But that means that in a country of only 25, 26 million people, 500,000 adults are asking for information that is more than they're currently getting, and they're asking for a royal commission, which means that it's independent of the government to look into this. There is definitely an underlying problem in the information structure inside of Australia, and part of that is through the Murdoch empire, which owns almost every local newspaper, every city newspaper, and each of the national newspapers in Australia, as well as 2 or 3 of the TV stations. So there's your problem. Your media and your influencers are getting, the influencers getting control and getting the information into the media, which then controls the minds of the people in this great description, weapon of mass deception. Thank you, Daryl. I'll keep that one.
Yeah. Dr. Wang, Daryl just said that, ASPI is part of Australia's military-industrial complex. Do you look at that way too?
I mean, I would say it's just used by the third party as anti-China's tool. And also it is just, to some extent, I think it's just to put Australia and become like the front line of so-called this anti-China movement, which this institution obviously just misleading not only the Australian people but also the English-speaking countries and even the wider world. So I would think it's just sabotaging the Sino and the Australian relationships here.
And do you think that is subject to change if we have a new president, post November the 3rd?
Well, we definitely hope for, but we will look in the future what's going to happen.
Daryl, let me bring you back. Australian Financial Review's article also cites Bob Carroll, former Premier of the New South Wales, who says ASPI pumps out a one-sided pro-American views of the world. Also, a former ambassador to China, Jeff Raby, also says, I see it as very much the architect of the China threat theory in Australia. Why is so hawkish against China?
Well, I think it's important to remember that ASPI makes no pretense about academic objectivity. The purpose is to produce analysis and research that broadly supports the views of their funding sponsors. Now, there's a simple test for their claim for independence. ASPI produces no research that genuinely takes the opposite position to their accepted narrative from their sponsors. So, for instance, you won't find any ASPI research supporting China's activity in the South China Sea. So their work is not objective. That's not what its purpose is. But what they have been very successful in doing is convincing the media, particularly the Murdoch media, that they are somehow independent, that they are not influenced by the money paid to them by the US arms manufacturers and the States Department of the United States. So they've been very successful in pulling the wool, as we would say, over the eyes of the Australian media, the public and many politicians by claiming that their reports are independent and objective and are not making it clear that their reports are often funded by foreign agencies and governments. Now, business groups like the Australia-China Foundation, the Chamber of Commerce, the Australia-China Business Council are getting very concerned about this media hysteria. Now, of course, ASPI is not solely responsible, but their influence has to be acknowledged. And a bright light needs to be shone on their funding sources and their role as a registered agency of foreign influence.
Right. Let's try to be hopeful, at least at this point. my final question to both Jerry and Daryl is, what or who do you think can still salvage China-Australia relations at this point? Daryl, why don't you start?
I think one of the most important points is business organisations have to step up and make sure their voices are heard in this discussion. So it's no longer a one-sided discussion. And the media helps by being professional, by acknowledging that the reports that are coming from ASPI are funded by foreign influence. They're funded by foreign companies and foreign governments. Doesn't mean the research is necessarily inaccurate, but it is biased in a particular direction. Because, as the Western saying is, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
So, Jerry, what do you think? What can prevent China-Australia ties from a free fall?
I'm a little less optimistic than Daryl, I think. He's looking for the business community to help, and sure they can and should. The business community needs to get the word out, and the way to get the word out is through the media. And currently the media is widely controlled by one man who is no longer even an Australian. He was an Australian, born an Australian, but an American citizen now. I think that what Daryl says is absolutely correct. It needs to be a concerted effort. The one good thing, the one optimistic thing that I have about this is that there are people in very senior positions. You've mentioned Bob Carr, a former leader of the government. I've mentioned Kevin Rudd. We're talking about the Senate, and there are many questions being asked in the parliamentary houses, and I think that's the important thing. That needs to keep on happening, and it really needs to be brought out into the open, and it needs to be absolutely identified what Daryl says. This is an organization that receives its funding from foreign governments, and if not foreign governments, from weapons manufacturers. And one point that hasn't been made is that one of the biggest contracts Australia has ever given for weaponry was to Lockheed Martin, just the same time as ASPI received a $134,000 payment for giving advice about which weapons to buy against China, against the China threat. So ASPI are not really out there on the open doing the benefit or to the benefit of the Australian public.
Well, actually, SPI reminds me of CSIS, another think tank, hawkish think tank in Washington, D.C. that is often believed to be part of the military-industrial complex of the United States. Thank you all so very much, our guests for tonight. Thank you for the discussion. And that will do it for this edition of The Point. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thank you for tuning in.